Welcome to Accelerated, my podcast on the cross-section of technology, capital, and the world we live in. On this episode, my guest is Dave Troy, an entrepreneur, TED organizer and speaker, and a well-regarded disinformation researcher. If you're a current or a future startup founder or have one in your life, I wrote a book for you. After many years in the trenches and on all sides of the table in Silicon Valley, I wrote Accelerated Startup as a minefield guide to help founders save a lot of headache and heartache those first critical few years. You can get Accelerated Startup on Amazon, iBooks, or Audible. If you're new to the show, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. Now, put on your seatbelts, and we're about to enter the deep, dark world of online disinformation and misinformation and psyops. Dave Troy is an entrepreneur, speaker, and disinformation researcher based in Baltimore, Maryland. He was the first to use the Twitter API, and his data visualization work has been featured in the Museum of Modern Art and at TED. He co-curates TEDx Mid-Atlantic in Washington, D.C., where many of his speakers have been Washington insiders. As his day job, he is the CEO of 410 Labs, maker of the email tools Maelstrom and Chuck. Dave's work on disinformation intersects sociology, network science, and political science. So please help me welcome Dave.
Hey there, Vitaly. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here, Dave. So let's dive right in. I know you have a fascinating story. We've known each other for many years now. Let's start at the beginning with your first tech company and how you became a techie.
Yeah, sure. So I first started getting involved with, computers and programming kind of, with the Apple II generation. I was more on the Atari side, but I started my first company at about age 14, started selling computers and software and stuff in high school. That then evolved to selling that stuff on the internet in like 1993, 94 timeframe. And that in turn led me to get involved with internet infrastructure and started an ISP and hosting company around 95 timeframe. Then grew that, added in a telephone company, was involved in the founding of that in the late 90s after the passage of the Telecom Act of 96. And then grew that business gradually until 2004 when I sold it. So that was kind of my first entrepreneurial journey from age 16 to 14 to 30, basically 32. And then from there, started doing a lot of work in, kind of emerging technologies around voice over IP. I did some work in Europe and in Brazil on that. And then from there, got involved with Twitter. Right in the early days of that. So as you mentioned, I was the first person to use the Twitter API and did a project called Twitter Vision that was a real-time visualization of all the traffic on Twitter, which at the time wasn't very much. So that was kind of fun to see that be birthed. And I got to know Jack Dorsey and Biz Stone and that whole crew during that time. And then, in the intervening years, I've started another company called 410 Labs. We make two products. One is called Chuck, which is an iOS app for managing email a lot more efficiently. And the other is called Maelstrom, which is a web-based tool that works similarly. It's a little bit different in focus, but they're both designed to help people deal with email overload. And then, along the way, I've also been engaged with civics. So, dealing with things like our political landscape, understanding the intersection between technology and politics. And that has really led to a deep engagement on, social media disinformation, how society can be manipulated, which of course you can't really understand that stuff without also trying to understand social psychology, political science, those kinds of dynamics. So it's been an interesting ride over the last 4 years in particular.
Thanks for that background. So, just like many guys are our age, it seems, or, we're a few years apart, but I also started very young as a little BBS nerd.
Yep.
Back in the day.
Yeah, total BBS in my case.
Yeah. And a lot of, guys these days in their, let's say 40s, all started with kind of hacking around the internet and the early internet. And many have gone on to build interesting companies. Like Jan Koum comes to mind. He was part of that group with the politician who was also part of the hacking group in the 90s.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about kind of how Twitter was in the early days. And I think it's a really interesting story of, these days people consider Twitter this behemoth, even though it's, in valuation, it's like 1/16th the size of Facebook, something like that. What was it like, and what was it like to kind of see that develop and kind of really catch fire and become what,
Well,
what Twitter is?
it was very interesting. I mean, I think it was interesting to me because it was filled with kind of early adopter types, and it was sort of the first single platform global network that was sort of easily accessible and programmable from the standpoint of trying to understand the data sets. So my initial inquiry was like, well, I'm here, I'm looking at this. Who else is here and looking at this? Why are they here? Are they people that I know? Are they people that I should have known? So I started looking at kind of the people in my geography, around Baltimore, Washington area, and trying to understand, what their motives were, what kinds of cliques formed within that construct, and kind of like where this thing was heading. And I think the thing that probably characterizes the earliest days of Twitter the most is just that it was not very well used. People were, very rarely participating in any kind of volume. The people that were kind of a cast of regulars. It was kind of like something like Clubhouse is today, where it's kind of known mostly to kind of tech people, and it's kind of cliquey, right, and that kind of thing. And so it went from being that to, I always think of the Clay Shirky book, Here Comes Everybody, and then everybody joins in and it becomes something else through like emergent effects. And I think that it's taken a long time to get it to where it is now, and I don't know that it's better now. I think that in a lot of ways, not a lot of thought was given to the design. So the emergent effects that have occurred have been mostly negative, rather than being positive things. So
yeah, I mean, there's certainly a few different eras in Twitter and social media development in the last decade. I think it was a really big awakening to this whole group of companies that grew around Twitter ecosystem. And then one day Twitter decided to say that there's not going to be any third-party applications and all of that, and started killing off that whole ecosystem. I remember that was a big issue. At what point, I mean, it kind of realized, Twitter itself realized that it became kind of some important communication method. At what point, did you watch this and kind of see all these other forces coming from non-tech to use this platform for a lot of different purposes?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it was the evolution towards doing an IPO, because I think that there was a sense that like they had no real business model, and they hadn't developed sort of the ad model yet. They didn't really have a large enough user base to really monetize well, so they were kind of just burning cash very rapidly. And there was a pressure, I think, to go public in order to relieve that pressure and give them more runway. But at the same time, they were also very reluctant to crack down on what I would call, either inauthentic activity on the platform or just straight up fraudulent activity on the platform in terms of people making accounts that weren't real. So I think that there was a pressure for them to inflate their user numbers, that, led to kind of a culture of sleight of hand at the company a little bit. And I don't think it was intentional. I don't think that people were like trying to mislead per se, but just it's kind of like there's always a pressure to kind of like say the most optimistic thing you possibly can, especially in the context of an S1 or something like that. So, I think that has led to kind of where we are now, where they are incented to kind of have as many live accounts on the platform as possible. Which means
in result, they're glossing over all these bots and all this cesspool that exists on
exactly,
there, yeah.
And they never really addressed that problem in any kind of serious way. Obviously, they're now doing stuff to take down networks of accounts that are coordinated and whatever. But I mean, is that enough? Did they start soon enough? Are they doing as much as they could now? You don't really know. They're sort of walking this fine line between doing something to address the problem, but also not put out numbers that make it seem like their monthly actives are dropping too much. So it's kind of a fine dance.
And I mean, you have an interesting insight because you've seen this develop, and you know the team. Jack, and him being a part-time CEO, I think a lot of people have identified as problematic with something that's supposedly so important in our communication sphere. does this reflect his personality? I know he's kind of changed and found, enlightenment in these years, but this kind of wild internet, is that something that you would say is compatible with his personality?
Well, I don't want to disparage a friend, and
Yeah.
think that he's put out plenty of public statements to kind of explain what it is he thinks he's doing. I would just say that I think that he maybe has a certain personality of like wanting things to kind of turn out for the best and kind of looking for the best outcomes, and kind of thinking that with the lightest possible touch, the better outcome can be achieved. I think that might be the most subtle way I could say it. And I think that this whole situation with him and Square is probably a little bit of fairy tale storytelling on the part of the boards of both of those companies. Like, I have a hard time understanding how a board could reach the conclusion that that's the best answer for both companies. So, you have to ask yourself how much of that is kind of the land of make-believe and storytelling versus, what's really going on and what's best for the companies. But, I guess...
Yeah, I would chalk it up into the famous made-up story about the pest dispensers in eBay, right? That was the origin story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
every company needs this mythology, and the mythology right now is that Jack Dorsey is, a super genius and can run two major companies, two major public companies, and that seems, perhaps ambitious. Yeah.
So if you were to run Twitter, I mean, you're an experienced entrepreneur most of your life. You were CEO running different companies. How would you fix it? What would you change?
Yeah, I mean, I think first off, my experience is with much smaller companies, so I feel a little bit talking out of turn to some extent to sort of make suggestions for companies that big. However, I think the fundamentals really just need to boil down to kind of focusing on telling the truth, making sure that the platform, has as much truth and sort of, I don't mean so much, facts. I mean, like, are the people that are on the platform really who they say they are? And so start to work more towards verifying identities of as many people as possible. This whole idea of like all these little people with the little blue check marks, which, I've never pursued for myself. It's kind of like, there's a tiny fraction of people that have that designation on Twitter, and it leads to this kind of free-for-all landscape where people can just kind of do whatever they want. The other thing is, I think that I've come to see Twitter a little bit like an alternate reality game, or just a game of a sort, where it encourages you to sort of withdraw into bubbles of like-mindedness that I think are generally unhealthy for society. And so I would start to look at the design effects of the platform on society. Basically, the idea being, if you can affect the texture of society with tools like this, then you are able to program society effectively. So the question would then be, what kind of society should we program our society to be? What do we want to program our society to do? And how do we do that ethically? And I just don't think that feedback loop has been given sufficient thought. So I would start to move in that direction of like, what kind of effect do we as Twitter want to have on society? And, you've heard Mark Zuckerberg say, we're going to, connect everybody and everything's going to be great just because everybody's connected. And, I think we can see that that's not true. It's objectively a bad idea. So, you clearly have to do more than just connect everybody. So then the question is what, and, what things might we do to create a healthier society versus a sicker society?
Yeah, I mean, so let's talk about that for a second. I mean, ultimately, the stakes have gone through the roof, right? Before it was, okay, our kids are spending too much time, wasting too much time, let's say, on social media. But now the stakes are real life. You have protests in Wisconsin right now, right, as we're recording this. And some groups of idiots have organized themselves, apparently in the Facebook group, which resulted with a 17-year-old with a rifle shooting 3 people, killing 2 last night.
Yep. Yeah. There's real world consequences.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of, if we kind of skip ahead a couple of steps here, there's a lot of talk about the potential for TikTok being dangerous platform and being kind of this malware from China. And famously, Zuck had this dinner with Trump at the White House and said that it's China or Facebook, support us and ban TikTok, which was kind of a genius business move, right, to kill his competition. But in your view, and I'm sure you've thought about this, can you kind of compare the potential, the negative potential of TikTok, besides the time wasting, watching videos and not being productive, but the danger there versus the active measures that we've already seen for years on Facebook and Twitter?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is some reason for concern, and well before Zuck or Trump or anybody else was mentioning this, certainly people in the information security and national security world were talking about how this could be a potential danger because, something like TikTok is capturing high resolution facial data. It has the potential to capture social graphs. It has the potential to capture location information. It was doing stuff like pasting from the clipboard from other apps. So, there's a lot of potential kind of technical vector threat there that I think, is real. I think, we have to evaluate this, though, within the framework of U.S. law and the First Amendment. And, we have to actually say, what do we think the threat is here, really? And if so, if there is a threat that's deemed, how do we want to best address it? Now, the fact that, they were violating effectively terms of service of things like the App Store, Google's Android store, the Play Store, those companies might want to impose limits on them and say, look, you cannot be pasting stuff from the clipboard. That's just ridiculous. Stop doing that. And, by the way, if you're going to be storing, facial data or, recording these videos, these are some standards we want you to meet. I mean, there's a lot of other levers besides for just some amorphous governmental ban that could be applied. And we just didn't really seem like we explored any of that. And furthermore, whatever this ban that Trump has been proposing, there doesn't seem to be any legal framework within which to do that. I mean, I don't know what law.
He also wants a commission on the sale.
Yeah, exactly. He wanted a cut, piece of the vig on the deal, so it's like, it's a very typical
real estate agent, always a real estate agent.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's kind of a real estate mobster move, so it's, I think that we really can evaluate this in a legal way. And I think we're going to need to think about this, but I would much rather see us pass laws that clearly define what it is we think we're talking about rather than just enact random amorphous bans on things.
Yeah, but could it be as simple, let's play kind of the reverse of devil's advocate, the angel's advocate? Could it be just an overeager developer or them trying to capture a lot of data to improve their algorithm and they have no intention of exporting the data, somehow selling it or giving it to the government?
Yeah, I think that that's entirely possible. And I think we should assume that that's probably the case, sort of Occam's razor style. I think the danger is, to the extent that that stuff is domiciled, in China at some point, which, it's not clear even that that's the case, then that, they would have potential access to it if they wanted to get to it. But it's not clear that it's like, it was built by Chinese intelligence or something like that. I'm not saying it's not. I just haven't seen any evidence of that. So.
Yeah. And you did some really fascinating visualizations on these kind of networks of people on social media. I think it would be great if you can talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing more recently and how these connections and these conversations that live in these islands of social media, how they might be driving kind of real world effects, both in politics and in the COVID world and misinformation there and all these things that you're seeing spinning out there.
Kind of sure. Yeah. Actually, if it's okay, I can share a slide of one of these maps just to give you an idea of what you're talking about here. Let me go ahead and do that.
Let's bring that in.
There we go. So this is a map of Puerto Rico, social map, not a geographic map. So each dot is a Twitter user and each line is a friend connection between them. And then the size of the dots is representing the number of followers relative in the network. And then the colors are basically communities of like minds. So if you actually dig into these communities, you find that people sort themselves into fairly, predictable sectors in between different societies. So there's usually like a sports cluster and a techie cluster. And, Puerto Rico seems to have more government stuff, maybe not surprisingly. Radio, television, media is often in the center. This is like a bunch of club culture stuff here. These are all students from University of Puerto Rico. More students added in a different cohort because they had a couple of big spurts of new Twitter users in Puerto Rico. This is another cohort. And then this always comes up. There's always some note of like One Direction, Justin Bieber, kind of people that float around between different networks.
Pop culture.
A lot of.
And then, by the way, not to interrupt you, but for the listeners of the audio version of this podcast, maybe you can quickly summarize what this might look like on the screen for those watching.
Yeah, sure. So what we've got is kind of a colorful array of different networks. It's sort of a network map with different clusters within the network that show different groups of people, and then lots of overlap between them. But there is, some distinct sorting and differentiation. So, for instance, the people on the left, the orange group, that's mostly young students and whatnot, they have almost no connections to like the government folks on the right. So you start to ask questions like, well, why are there are these divisions in a given society, and could we do things to try to bring those things closer together? And should we do those things? Is that something that would actually produce a beneficial outcome? So it's an interesting tool to understand just kind of how society sorts itself. And then as you do this kind of thing, you start to see how disinformation could be applied to different audiences here to get different reactions out of them. And that's a lot of what was done with like Cambridge Analytica and the like.
Yeah, and it seems like although nobody wants to be put into a group and be called be part of this monolith, so to say. In reality, people's social networks, on average, are pretty much in these social groups. They might be by race or by age or by juxtaposition. And reality is reality, and you have a lot of you do these brilliant visualizations that are easy to follow, but behind the scenes, all the political pollsters and all the pros pushing things around ever since the Southern strategy in the U.S. Have probably noticed these effects and know how to kind of pull the strings, right?
Yeah, and these kinds of artifacts come up in different ways. This is looking at it from a network map perspective, but that you do see these things demographically. You can get at these different slices by looking at even things like fashion. Like if you know that somebody wears a certain brand of sneaker, there's a pretty good chance that they're going to fall into some kind of sociometric kind of category. And so you'll be able to address them a certain way. So all these kinds of things that we kind of take for granted and also use as ways to express ourselves as people do in fact, reveal kind of like what sociographic group, we belong to. So very interesting stuff.
Yeah, and then in March, you upped a pretty impressive group of folks to start looking at the situation with COVID that became acute. And quickly, a lot of the focus went, and I was involved in the chats, and I still kind of read through and try to get a good, clear picture on all the research being done. But from the perspective of information, I think you called it very early on and saw that this is going to become another dis and misinformation battlefield. And it really has become so very quickly in this country, especially. What have you seen, kind of, what can you say about how this information warfare has been applied to this COVID topic?
Yeah, so, it's pretty well known at this point that anytime you have a major crisis, there's going to be a wave of misinformation and disinformation that follows it, just because people are trying to get facts, and there's a lot of incentive sometimes to spread, information that isn't true. And it can also be, a very fruitful field for, really narrative battles and advancing other things that are already in play. So in the United States, where, we already had a contentious political year on tap, and then you add in this crazy, giant public health thing that completely upends everybody's lives globally, we knew that was going to set the stage for a lot of crazy, kind of stories to come out. So I would say that, it's been kind of interesting to watch it evolve. In the first couple of months, we saw just a lot of crazy stuff in terms of people talking about 5G being related to coronavirus and, hydroxychloroquine and, different kinds of folk remedies and, just all of these different narratives that were coming out about, masks or not masks and everything, kind of conflating. And what's been interesting from my perspective is that it actually has calmed down a little bit in that, we've seen Twitter, Facebook, other platforms react fairly forcefully to take down medical misinformation where we can find it. There was the pandemic video, which came out in late April, which went very viral before anybody even knew what it was. And that was a case where maybe we reacted a little bit too late, but we still kept it from getting too out of hand. And now what I'm seeing is that things that have been kind of in a similar vein have been intercepted much sooner. And what we in this trade are calling it is sort of getting it before the boom, before it can have like a major societal effect, and it creates a lot of disruption. So, on the one hand, I think we're in much better shape than we were in 2016 in terms of, developing systems to intercept these things sooner versus later. But at the same time, there's still stuff that just gets through, and, you never really know what it's going to be, because it doesn't necessarily even matter what the content is. It's just like whatever things can get through that are both virulent and also do not meet the standards of like the people looking for bad stuff immediately. That's the stuff that can get a foothold really, really quickly. And then you kind of have to spend another, week fighting it back after you've taken it down and tried to deplatform it. And of course, there are the conspiracy theorists who are saying that, because these things are deplatformed, that it's all, a big conspiracy to, suppress people's speech and limit their medical treatments and whatever else. So, I guess overall, I'm glad it's not worse than it is, but it's still pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of conspiracy theories, the ultimate one now is this absurdistan that is QAnon.
Yep.
And I was just thinking this morning that, this is really perfect for this country, for these people that really want to believe this, that these kind of speculative bubbles. I think QAnon is kind of the speculative bubble, the Bitcoin equivalent of conspiracy theories, right? It's kind of the ultimate conspiracy theory, and now it's of course at the top. And RNC, there are a bunch of people in RNC. I think a couple of speakers are still on board that are a big part of this. What are your thoughts on that whole thing, and how do we get that under control and out of the mainstream?
Well, I think the first thing you have to start to do is to develop kind of a systems level understanding of what all this stuff actually is. So the first thing you have to kind of do is divorce yourself from the idea that like this is about, what people's actual beliefs are. This is about group identity and about belonging to a group or not belonging to a group. So in the case of, like QAnon, what we've seen is that a lot of different conspiracy theories have kind of merged into one kind of like grand unified conspiracy theory to rule them all. And, that's convenient in that it kind of acts as a catch-all basket that people can kind of, it's like a box full of Legos. You can kind of assemble it however you want to tell whatever story you want. But the main story that it tells, and the main sort of group identity thing that comes with that stuff, is that you do not believe the mainstream media narrative. You do not believe in, science or reality or whatever the Democrats are saying, or whatever. It's this alternate reality of kind of saying, I opt out of all of this and I am going to withdraw into this world that is characterized by these other ideas. And so I think that one of the things that we predicted when this whole pandemic thing started and everybody was in social isolation was that people were going to feel a real lack of connection to family, to community, to each other, and that they were going to be hungering for things that gave them meaning and identity. And almost always that turns out to be things like conspiracy theories or cults. And if you really study cults, this is basically the same dynamics that we're going through. So cult studies have actually turned out to be very helpful in understanding this situation. And one of my friends that I'm talking to a lot right now is a guy named Steve Hassan, who is one of the leading experts on cults. So the way people get sucked into cults is because they start to feel a connection with the people in the group, and then they start to feel less of a connection with their families, and they eventually kind of get sucked into the cult and away from their family and their other friends, to the point where they start to see anybody that isn't in the cult as being kind of fundamentally evil and part of the problem. And so they then start to resent them, etc. And then the people that that are outside that want to retrieve like their loved ones from this toxic construct, they're seen as the enemy when they go try to talk to them and that sort of thing. So It's the exact same dynamics. So the good news is we kind of know what's going on from a sociology standpoint. The bad news is that typically with cults, you're talking about deprogramming a few people out of a few hundred person group. This is like deprogramming possibly tens of millions of people globally. One researcher, a friend of mine, has traced QAnon now into 71 countries. That was 10 days ago, maybe. So it's probably into 100 countries by now. And it's, all taking root in like local languages, local stories, local narratives, but tied into this sort of grand mythology of, some kind of global pedophile elite doing whatever. And it's people becoming unhinged. And, you want to say that they're crazy. The dangerous thing, though, is that they're not really that crazy. They're people that maybe for whatever reason were susceptible to these kinds of messages and then started going down a rabbit hole. But they're not fundamentally like stupid usually. They're not, mentally ill in any kind of quantifiable way. They're just susceptible. And we are too. There's stuff that can catch us up, and we all have to be susceptible, or careful that we're not pulled into these kinds of things. That we've got what my friend Steve likes to call freedom of mind, that we are actually in control of our own faculties and judgments.
Yeah, and then do you see, certainly the foreign actors that are taking advantage to kind of just cause chaos, to normalize and use that kind of as a way to bring down US or Western society in general. What have you seen kind of both on COVID and this QAnon thing? Have you seen a lot of push and pull from these foreign organized actors?
Yeah, certainly, there's been a lot of sort of shifting narratives from, both Russia and China. China's sort of getting a little bit more aggressive about their disinfo game. They've backed off a little bit in the recent few weeks, but, they had traditionally been kind of more in the mode of, sort of advancing their own state interests and, putting assets in place that would guarantee long-term competitive advantage. Russia's been much more of the mind to try to attack kind of the fabric of our society with the aims of destabilizing democracy. But China's been sort of playing in that game too by helping to amplify some of these conspiracy theories. They put out conspiracy theories or amplified conspiracy theories that said that, like a U.S. serviceman in China was responsible for the spread of the virus, and, various kinds of things like that. So they're using this as a backdrop to, amplify the tensions that exist, in our culture already. And, a lot of the stuff around the fact that, the virus is hitting predominantly people of color and lower income people here, that's provided a rich context for them to, further amplify the kinds of racial divides that we've seen previously. But it's more or less a continuation of the 2016 playbook. And I think people might really, misunderstand, kind of the nature of this thing. It isn't so much about swaying the election one way or the other, although I'm sure if they could, sort of like spend X amount of money to achieve a specific result, they would. But it's more about driving this kind of cultish behavior, because the more that we're driven into these kind of cultish configurations, the less functional our democracy is, the less able we are to reach consensus and have actually reasoned debate about anything. So, it's not about trying to get X number of votes. It's about trying to get a certain percentage of the population to kind of go off the deep end. And to disengage.
What end though? What's the goal?
Well, to get people to the point where they just really are demoralized and they don't think that there's any way to effectively self-govern. And what that ultimately does is it kind of makes people draw the judgment that the United States is not any better than what amounts to a criminal authoritarian regime like Russia is right now. If they can generate that equivalence, then it'll get us off their back. It will allow them to operate their criminal gangs with impunity, and it will generally make their lives a lot easier. And not only that, we won't be wagging our fingers at them, telling them that they don't have the moral high ground. So I can understand why they want to do this. I mean, it makes total sense. It's just it's not something we need to succumb to, and it's I think people are oversimplifying what the nature of their motives is. I think it really is about trying to make our country as crappy as possible.
Right. I mean, do you think we'll ever get back to normal discourse? Let's say. I mean, I want to hear your predictions on the election in a second, but before we get there, let's say it does go well. in the way that I think most of my listeners are thinking, that we get back to normal. We have politicians that can be respected again in power, trying to improve this country. Do you think that the media landscape is fixable, or are we forever stuck on this kind of vector in this parallel universe of Back to the Future 2, where it's all bad and media is not respected and doesn't have a place in kind of informing people anymore?
Yeah, I do think that things are going to get better. I think that one of the things that has been interesting about this whole pandemic is that it's taught us all about virus math and all about rates of transmission and stuff like that. So I keep thinking, like, if we can get this kind of cultish behavior, sort of like the new recruits into QAnon and other kinds of nonsense points of view, to have an RT value of 1.0 or less, then we can start to get things back on track. And a huge amount of how we perceive the world and about how we, think things are going to be is kind of like what the current trend is. So right now, these conspiracy communities are growing and getting worse and more toxic. And we have all these news stories about people, joining these things and getting involved in stupid stuff, and, family members that are getting pulled into it. So it seems like right now it's growing and getting worse, which I think makes people feel pretty bad. I think if we can start to get the RT value to 1.0 or less for these things and get them to shrink, then those things will start to seem more fringe, and they'll seem more, anathematized by society as a whole. And that, I think, is going to give people the sense that, like, things are moving in the right direction. And I think that, media tends to follow culture pretty closely. So, we're going to, I think, if we can get those kinds of numbers to start to come down, then we're going to start to see media kind of follow suit in terms of how they perceive this and cover it. And I also think that there's a lot of substantial, thoughtful work that's being done right now on how to curb, misinformation and disinformation. Like, I work with someone named Sarah Jane Terp, who has built a framework called AMIT, along with a lot of other thoughtful, InfoSec people, myself included. And it really includes an entire framework for identifying, stopping, curbing, fighting back against these kinds of problems in society. And so, it's kind of like anything. You have to first identify the problem. You then have to build a solution tool chain to kind of, figure out how to address it. You then have to implement it. There has to be economic incentives to do that. We may or may not have those right now. We may have to regulate. So this may take a little while, but I think that, if we can sort of stop the bleeding right now in terms of, we have this ridiculous political culture right now that isn't informed by really anything. There is no platform, as we saw this week.
Right.
If we can slow down some of this radicalization processes in society, then things will move in the right direction, and we can actually address this. It's just, it's democracy.
Are you positive that we can do this? Because, I mean, from my perspective, it seems like we're going down this black hole, and it's looking worse and worse every month.
I don't know that we will. I think we potentially can. So I think there's reason to have hope in that regard, just that, it should be possible. But again, a lot will hinge on November. So
yeah. And before we get to that question and that set of predictions, do you think when let's say realistically, maybe at the earliest, the vaccination for COVID will come out, let's say early next year or maybe mid next year, do you think, what do you expect from kind of the information warfare standpoint of trying to talk people out of it? And do we have a chance of actually getting enough people to take the vaccine to be effective?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult to know, exactly how people are going to react to this. I mean, obviously, there's going to be a large number of people that are going to say, "Oh, I'm not going to take it," and potentially have reasons why. But there will be an attempt to cast a lot of doubt on it by hostile actors, and we're going to have to try to combat that. But at the same time, if we rush this thing, there may be very good reasons to have doubt about it. Right. If, for instance, I heard something today about Trump trying to accelerate the AstraZeneca vaccine until like before the election. And I'm like, well, first off, I don't know how you'd make that many or any number of a reasonable number of doses before then. But if that were to happen, I mean, you would want to have reasonable questions about that. And what is this thing? And is it potentially going to work, or is it going to make people sick? Or, we just don't know. So I think we're going to have to kind of temper our expectations a little bit on the timing side in order to build up enough, confidence that this will be an effective, treatment. And then, hopefully by the most common answer I've heard from polling smart people right now is like Q2 of next year. That seems possible.
That seems right. So about a year is probably the fastest ever, right? But there's
but at least that's like plausible. I would say probably, the more outside kind of prediction might be late next year or mid 2022, but who knows? I mean, we're flying blind right now. So
yeah. We could probably do a whole different podcast on the science behind all that. So let's get to the $18 trillion question. What are your predictions for the election? What are you seeing right now, and kind of compare it to the social, the media, the knowledge, the info space of 2016?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a different landscape now with this whole, pandemic and voting by mail type scenario. It's quite difficult to game out. And, I know, people like Nate Silver, who, sort of famously got it, quote unquote, wrong in 2016, have, said right now that, Joe Biden's looking, relatively stronger, but, that could change at any time. And, I think it's also important to recognize that, neither Nate Silver nor many of the pollsters strictly got it wrong. They just, the result landed within the low probability chance that they gave Trump, and,
statistics are not predictions, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, I think you have to kind of take all that stuff with a grain of salt. The thing that's been honestly on my mind with this, I think, if it was a straight election under normal circumstances, Biden would probably win it because, there were so many extenuating circumstances last time, not the least of which was people's extreme dislike of Hillary Clinton, that, I think led to that outcome, plus whatever manipulation may have happened. Who knows? It was a very tight, race in the end. This race, I think, could be just as tight. I do think it probably favors Biden, but the thing that I think will be dangerous is how disinformation and narrative warfare were going to take hold in the weeks following the actual election day. So a lot of reporters have cautioned to say, look, we're not going to have the results on election day. It's going to be an election season. There's going to be votes coming in over the course of a number of weeks. We're not going to probably have a good sense of what the final answer is until late November, early December, something like that. And during that time, there are going to be predictions, various kinds of assertions made by all sorts of people about what the outcome either is or is going to be. And then there's going to be narratives that develop around what the legitimacy of different aspects of the vote are. So I'm sure Trump is going to try to do something like say, well, we know that the people that voted in person voted for me, which may or may not turn out to be true. That's just a guess. And then, start to try to cast doubt on all of these quote unquote, shady mail-in ballots that are coming in from shady states like California, and try to cast, doubt on the entire process and make people believe that, the election has been stolen. And, we heard glimmers of that in 2016, that he was going to use that kind of a narrative strategy. So there's every reason to think he'll use it now. And certainly, Russia would back a strategy like that and try to sow doubt in people's minds around what actually happened. So I think that's kind of what we most have to be prepared for. And it will be a drag, and we'll all just groan through it because it's going to be horrible. But I mean, the best case
scary part was that in 2016, he didn't even expect to win. He was just playing the game. And now his motivation is to keep his family out of prison and himself as well for all these things that are being discovered every other day.
Yep, exactly. So he's much more motivated now than he was in 2016. At least in 2016, he could just go on and have Trump TV if he lost. Now it's a much bigger game. So, I don't know. I think it's going to be very interesting, and I think that the best case scenario would be some kind of just really clear, decisive victory by Biden with no real opportunity for undermining that with some other narrative. But as we know, this is messy, and we've got a huge fiasco on our hands with different states and their ballot procedures and the mail and everything else. So who knows how it's going to play out. Should be interesting.
One place where blockchain could actually be useful.
Well, I'm good friends with this guy, Avi Rubin, who's like the leading expert on election technology. And, his take on it is that there's really no way to do online voting if you want to preserve both security and anonymity. You kind of need both of those things. On the security side, there's really no way to detect a man-in-the-middle attack by a state actor. And then on the anonymity side, you want to be able to, for sure say that you can't trace somebody's vote back to them and punish them for their vote. And right now we can kind of do that with the system we have. It's not perfect, but it more or less meets both of those goals. Anything online wouldn't, even blockchain. So.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed learning from you as always, Dave. And I wanted to ask you one last question and kind of parting words for our audience. What can our audience do to fight the good battle on bullshit?
Yeah, I mean, it's a definitely sort of all of population kind of effort, and I appreciate that people want to help. I think the first thing to do is to kind of understand the nature of the problem. It's not strictly about facts or that kind of thing. It's about, this kind of group problem that we talked about, and about how people want to identify with an in-group or an out-group. So, try not to share stuff, as much as sharing factual things is important, try not to share stuff that's emotionally reactive, that's going to cause people to either, to choose to not be friends with you, like block you, or that is going to generate a highly emotional reaction, because that's kind of the fuel of this process. And in the cases where you do find yourself disagreeing with people, I think it's important to try to find ways to build common ground with them that aren't maybe the contentious subject, but something else that either you do agree on, or that, try to play up the fact that, hey, look, we're family, or, try to engage on other interests that you may have. But, this process of like losing touch with people over information that is produced by, bad faith actors trying to harm our society is not productive for us. And we are getting caught into it. And, I also think that it's important to recognize that our current political setup is a little bit of a live action role playing game, if you will. And all of the kind of parameters around what it means to be a Democrat and to be a Republican are very much generated by these cultural forces that are, coming from our information landscape. And, if you are overreactive to those cues and you get a little bit too into the game, as it were, then you are being controlled. You are not actually in full command of your, free will and agency. So, the one way to kind of stay above that is to kind of look at this whole thing as a system, and to try to figure out how to get the outcome that you want, but not necessarily take on all of the, reactive identities that come with like being a Republican or a Democrat or whatever. Just try to get the outcome you want, but without becoming immersed in the drama of the day-to-day machinations of the game, because that's what they want you to do. And as soon as you become too reactive, you become controllable. There's a whole doctrine called reflexive control, where you can basically get people to do stuff by putting something in front of them that's going to make them react in a certain way. And if you become victim to that kind of reactivity, then you are no longer in charge. So I would just say try to stay above it. Try to share stuff that's factual. Try to maintain connections with lots of different kinds of people, and weather this storm, because it isn't going to be like this forever. It will be like this for a while.
So kind of abstain and diffuse.
Exactly. Yeah. Just step back and look at the big picture. So.
Yeah. And I lied. Okay. One last question. So, one thing I always enjoy talking to you and learning from you. And there are a lot of people that pick the topic du jour, and then all of a sudden they're Facebook experts in certain things. But you are a true expert in a lot of these things, and you've helped me understand a lot of these things, and a lot of people as well. My question to you is, when are you going to run for office, and what are you going to do? Because that's your voice can be amplified.
Yeah, no, it's certainly come up. I mean, I've been pretty active in civics in Baltimore, and I'm actually going to be joining the transition team of a guy who just won the position of comptroller in Baltimore. And I'm super big on audits because, we have something like 55 agencies and departments in Baltimore, and most of them haven't been really substantively audited in many, many years. And there's just so much that we can do in terms of best practice and that kind of thing. So, we'll see where that kind of thing goes. I personally feel like I can do a lot more sometimes by being kind of behind the scenes and being an advisor to people who have, are willing to go out and do things like win political contests, because that's hard. And, there's all kinds of factors that go into that. But, and I can do this kind of stuff over the course of 10, 12 years, as where they may only get a 4-year shot at it, so trying to have a longer term impact. But, certainly I think, being civically engaged right now is something that's really important. And we've, I think, told our, citizens that, voting is the most important thing you can do. And it is very important, but it's not necessarily the most important thing you can do. The most important thing you can do is to pay attention to the ongoing governance of your, town, city, whatever, and be engaged in that, because that's really where the, nuts and bolts and the gears of what goes on actually take place. The voting is just, who's overseeing it at any given day. So,
yeah. San Francisco is definitely off the rails as well these days.
Yeah, and they probably need some people to get in and work on the governance side. So,
Dave, again, I appreciate it. I appreciate your time. Thanks for being with us here today. So again, this was Dave Troy, my good friend, entrepreneur that does email related technology as his day job, but is really into helping the world deal with misinformation, disinformation, and for all of us to get through this mess and come out a stronger country, stronger world on the other side. So again, thanks, Dave, for being with us, and thanks for checking out our show.
Thanks a lot, Vitaly. See you next time.